Russian officials from the financial sector have increasingly started writing to Vladimir Putin about a possible economic crisis in the summer, reports the Washington Post, citing a source close to the situation. A Russian entrepreneur told the newspaper that the crisis could begin in as little as 3 or 4 months. Do you personally agree with the assessment from this source? And perhaps, do you know who this source is? Or maybe you have a guess.
Well, you see, when I read all this, I can never tell if it's true, whether this information actually existed or if the journalist made it up. It's quite difficult to interpret and comment on things like this. But the real situation in the Russian financial system is bad. In these lectures that I posted on YouTube, I wrote that the main pain point of the Russian economy is the federal budget of the Russian Federation. People in Russia don't always understand this and are often surprised. But the fact is, Russia is a country with a huge share of the state in the economy. Well, let me explain the difference between Ukraine and Russia. Would you like that? Yes, absolutely. So in Ukraine, before the war, small and medium-sized businesses accounted for up to half of the country's GDP. In Russia, it's barely 20%, if that. And the main share of GDP comes from large and major companies, both private and state-owned. The state's share in Russia's economy is at least 50%, but more likely closer to 70%. Half of Russia's population works for the state and receives their income from it. They get paid by the government every month. So when the government doesn't have money in the budget, just think about it. Half of Russia's population instantly finds itself in trouble. And in reality, it's even more, because that half is only among those who are employed. And then there are also pensioners, 42 million of them, who also receive money from the budget, because the budget collects funds to pay out pensions. Right now in Russia, both groups are in trouble. That's why all sorts of stories about delayed salaries are starting to happen. It's a return to the 1990s, when we got, the usual response, sorry, the money hasn't been transferred to our university's accounting department, so please wait, maybe in a month it will come through and we'll pay you then. In the meantime, you're on your own. Make do however you can, survive however you want. I've been working at the state university since the 90s, so I went through all of this myself. Luckily, I always knew how to pick up side jobs, so my family managed to get by. But if someone didn't have a side gig and relied solely on their salary, well, what if that person is a librarian or a paramedic? What kind of side job could they possibly have? They sit there exhausted from their main job and basically can't take on any other work. They're completely dependent on whether they get paid or not. Across Russia, letters are arriving from teachers and healthcare workers. They're missing salaries or bonuses. And without those bonuses, their pay is pitiful, next to nothing. And the government has no money. There just isn't any money, and it's only going to get worse. The year has just begun, and already, as far as we can tell, there's panic in the government because the budget doesn't add up. The deficit is enormous. So far, the first figure that has leaked is that the deficit is unexpected for them, unexpected for the Ministry of Finance, something over 1 trillion rubles. Now they're frantically trying to figure out where to get an extra trillion, because nothing adds up. And that's even though they didn't pay out in December, didn't pay out in January. There just wasn't enough money. It's not enough. And that means if they don't pay out, the economy starts to collapse. And when the economy collapses, it means the government isn't buying anything, isn't placing any orders, and your factory was working on government contracts. So where are you now? Out on the street. You got fired because the factory shut down. That's why Russia is now on the verge of a sharp rise in unemployment. Russians don't believe this yet. But we can see that it's already happening. Not very obviously, but it is happening. There are two figures I want you to hear. One is the official unemployment rate in Russia. President Putin loves to cite it. 2.1%, an insignificant unemployment rate. I am a great president. I've almost eliminated unemployment in Russia. What a wonderful figure. But there's another number provided by commercial organizations that handle recruitment. Recruiters, you know what that means, right? Well, they have a different figure. It's the ratio of job applications to available positions. Right now, as of early January, that ratio has reached 10. That means there are 10 applicants for every job opening. And by the way, if you look at IT specialists, the ratio there is 20. So in reality, it seems that unemployment in Russia is already very high. It just doesn't show up in the official statistics. That's why, to understand Russia, you shouldn't rely on official statistics. You need to gather a bunch of small, disparate facts and build a complete picture from them. It's a very hard job, but I'm used to doing it, and I keep doing it. So that's the situation. In other words, the threat of unemployment is growing in Russia. Accordingly, there's also the threat of poverty. And what's really interesting to us is that sociologists are saying people's moods have changed. In the first years of the war, Russians were, in a state of joy. There was a feeling that we would finally defeat the Ukrainians and finally we would start living well, that everything would be as it should, the world would respect us, and Russia would flourish under the president. Yes, we've broken ties with everyone, but now we'll have import substitution. Russia will blossom and thrive, and we'll live in a wonderful country. Now, all of that has dissipated after 4 years of war. So what do you expect, right? So now the mood is different. There's no growth, no improvement. Everything is going to be lousy. The only dream left is that things don't get worse than they are now.
By the way, yes, we started with the youth. Videos are surfacing across various social media platforms, showing a dramatic and sudden escalation in prices, and it's the youth vocalizing their disbelief and shock. Is there a chance, is there any real hope in this younger generation that they'll be able to actually make a change for the future? You know, back then, right when the war first started, throughout that entire first year, we all held on to hope. Well, we thought there are Russians after all, and they can handle just about anything. We all deeply hope for that. But there's just no hope left now. I'm simply asking, but is there still any hope remaining, so to speak?
Probably not.
No.
There's no hope. Let me explain. First of all, the Russian hope is very small in number. Don't forget that Russia is a country experiencing a demographic catastrophe. Those are harsh words, but it's simply a statement of fact. Russia is one of two countries that will see its population cut in half in the 21st century. Those countries are Russia and China. And Russia will lose half of its population by the end of the century. That's why there are so few young people. Just imagine what we mean by youth. These are people in their 20s. These are people born at the end of the 90s when birth rates were very low, and in the early 2000s when the rise was just beginning. There are simply very few of them. So that's why they're not really good for anything. They are, well, kind of politically inert. Just compare, for example, the behavior of students in France, students in America. Well, just remember how American students behaved during the Vietnam War.
Yeah, right.
You remember, right? Now look at Russia. 4 years of a terrible war, including partial mobilization. And have you seen even a single mass student protest against the war? Well, there hasn't been one. Although in the US, the police also cracked down on those students pretty hard, beat them quite brutally too. So it's not like it's one way here and another way there. No, students there didn't have it easy either, but they still went out. Russian students are discussing just one question right now. Should you sign up for a year as a drone operator in the special military operation if you failed your exams and flunked the semester? And you're asking me when Russian students will take to the streets en masse shouting, "Down with the war." Well, I find that hard to believe, sorry, but I just don't see it happening yet.
Well, look, I'd also like to hear your comment on something else here. President Zelensky literally stated that the Russian Federation would need at least 2 years, and that it would cost the lives of 800,000 of its soldiers to capture the Donbass. But they won't last that long. He made these remarks in an interview with the television channel France. They won't last that long. Am I correct in my understanding that Zelensky meant economically?
Well, Zelensky, as a politician, is also prone to presenting wishful thinking as reality. Let's not assume that what he says is the absolute truth, the ultimate authority. He is also prone to using certain propaganda cliches, saying that Russia has a margin of safety. There are a lot of unnecessary people in Russia, people who are surplus to requirements. I realize I'm saying some very inhumane things, but you have to understand I'm an economist, not a specialist in ethics or culture. As an economist, I understand that there are a lot of unnecessary people in Russia, people who are surplus to requirements. This is not just my point of view. Now it is being voiced by an increasing number of Russian experts. Suddenly you realize that there is a huge mass of people in the country who are needed by no one. They are not needed by the economy, not needed by their families, not needed by their loved ones. They are needed by no one, and they go to fight because they have no other option in life except to go, get a large payout, maybe help their relatives pay off huge consumer debts they've accumulated, and die, not entirely in vain, so to speak. It's a crazy setup, but it works. As you can see, a huge number of these half-drunk men are going. If you've ever seen photos of these contract soldiers in the courtyard of the military enlistment office, it's frightening to look at. You've probably seen photos of your prisoners of war. Just look at those types and you'll understand what I'm talking about. This is, well, how should I put it, the empty stratum of the Russian people. These are people with low qualifications who often drink, sometimes use drugs, are unwanted by anyone, often have no families, and have no purpose in life. And these are exactly the people who are eagerly recruited. There's even a curious business that has appeared in Russia during the war, you know. So criminal organizations have set up a wonderful business. They marry prostitutes to alcoholics, send the alcoholics to war, and the prostitutes receive money, most of which they hand over to the criminals. Such an interesting business has appeared in Russia. Well, why are you surprised? Tala, you're looking at a country that's going through an incredible process of social collapse. And the war has greatly accelerated this. It's a terrible story. It's horrifying to watch. But this is happening right before our eyes.
It's like when you thought you had hit rock bottom, but then someone knocks from below.
No, that's a favorite phrase in Russia. They knocked from below because the neighbors downstairs were worried.
All right, Igor.
Vladimirovich, Russians are making a lot of honest phrases these days, right?
Yes.
I really like this one. Someone gave me this phrase as well. Everyone thought that ahead of us there would be a window of opportunity. Turns out it was an asshole of opportunity. Russian humor in wartime. I apologize. But that's wartime humor. I didn't come up with it. I'm just quoting it.
As it is. Well, as it is. Finally, I can't help but ask about the sanctions and their effectiveness. Earlier, the US imposed a package of sanctions that affected Rosneft and Lukoil, and in the last weeks of 2025. My God, the beginning of 2026, the gross value of the Russian Federation's oil exports, I'm reading this to avoid mistakes, collapsed by 1.5 times. In fact, the oil tap has been tightened to its minimum since the start of the full-scale war. How have these restrictions already affected the Russian economy? Well, obviously the wallets of Russians and everything else. This is exactly what we talked about the other day. In other words, the economy, its oil-based model, has simply entered a stage of irreversible decline, a nosedive.
And this is not only due to the sanctions. The problem for Putin is that what was predicted has actually come true. But Putin never listens to anything. Even when he signs a document himself, I wrote about this. Let me explain. So about 10 years ago, I think, if not more, Putin, signed a document called the Concept of Economic Security of the Russian Federation. There was a passage in it that really impressed me, to say the least. It stated that the main threat to Russia's economic security is the global energy transition happening in various countries. In other words, the fact that countries around the world are moving away from oil dependency is a mortal threat to Russia. Am I explaining this clearly? That is, Russia is a country that sits on oil, lives off oil, feeds on oil, and is immensely wealthy because of oil. If the world moves away from oil and develops renewable energy technologies, this is a terrible misfortune for Russia. In other words, technological progress is a threat to Russia. Am I expressing my thought clearly? But this threat has materialized. The world is creating a different kind of energy sector. And in recent years, a very important process for me has been taking place, and I've been following it closely. And there was a very big problem. These renewable sources were defective. Why? Well, because when the sun is out, your panel works. It generates thermal electricity. The wind turns the blades. But if there's no wind and it's night, then what happens to the electricity? Oh, that's a problem. But now the situation has started to change. A new industry is emerging around this. As mentioned in many interviews, the battery energy industry is being born. That is, huge battery factories are being built, entire fields filled with specially manufactured industrial batteries that store electricity when the sun is shining or the wind is blowing and then release it at night. This means that a stable energy sector is emerging without the need for gas, coal, or fuel oil. And this is a threat to Russia because in this new global energy sector, it is not needed by anyone. I mean, sure, there will still be some oil and chemicals, but that's not enough to sustain Russia. And the energy component is disappearing, right? With the rise of electric vehicles, gasoline and diesel fuel are becoming unnecessary, right? And look, here's the thing. Last year in China, there was a boom in electric trucks. Not sedans, but trucks. Am I making myself clear? So who needs your gasoline and who needs your diesel fuel? Only the most underdeveloped countries in the world, but they're poor, they can't pay much. Who is Russia selling oil to now? India, China. But China is also starting to cut back. China has stopped buying Russian coal and started buying oil instead.
Nevertheless, India is already refusing to buy Russian oil.
It's clear, but when you're faced with a tough choice, either high tariffs and bankruptcy for Indian businesses or lower tariffs, but you don't buy from Russia, you have to choose the lesser of two evils. So now, as I understand it, India will be refusing as well. They will be supplied with Venezuelan oil. They know how to refine it. They know how to do it. Their refineries are ideal for this. Russian heavy oil, Urals, will find no buyers. This is a serious problem for Russia, as they have no alternatives. This financial crisis, the budget crisis, stems from that very issue. It is not just about discounts from sanctions. The entire global energy sector is being restructured, including the global inflationary market. And Russia is becoming, in this market, well, basically an uninteresting country, not needed or wanted by many, a country that could end up completely outside this market. In fact, Trump's goal, let's state it clearly so people understand what it's about, to kick Russia out of the global oil market completely and to take that place for American business.
Well, then it logically follows from what we discussed earlier. That's fate. The fate of the USSR awaits the Russian Federation.
By the way, did you see what Medvedev wrote?
No. Oh,
Come on now. Everyone says Lipsy is just telling scary stories. He just makes up all sorts of nasty things. He just stays up at night thinking up nasty things. Dmitry Anatolievich Medvedev, if you remember, the former president, former ally of Putin, wrote, "We need to learn from North Korea. They are very good at consolidating. We should take North Korea as an example."